Good morning. Welcome to the Deep 404. The Ukrainian woes grow with an announcement today from the French Defence Minister, Sébastien Lecornu. He has been in Kyiv this week. He's travelled there to speak with President Zelensky and has gone there to discuss how the French can continue to support Ukraine during this war. However, he has mentioned that France will transfer fewer weapons to Ukraine. His statement included the term that we're moving from a logic of transfers to an industrial partnership, which is becoming the norm. So this now makes France the second major NATO partner to announce to Ukraine that direct weapon supplies will be stopping over time. Poland announced that earlier this week. So for President Zelensky and for the Ukrainian offensive, this is not good news, clearly. They need these Western supplied weapons in order to be able to continue fighting the Russians. The ability for the Ukrainians to produce weapons themselves is severely limited. They've lost 25% of their country during this offensive. They've lost somewhere between 10 and 13, perhaps million of their population, have either fled to Russia or to nations in Europe. So this means that the Ukrainians are fully dependent upon the West and upon NATO for weapons to enable them to continue the fight. And if they're now seeing major partners like Poland and France winding this down, they are going to be unable to continue fighting in the way that they have been. Now, what's interesting is the approach that seems to be taken here by these nations is to move towards no longer providing direct weapons, but instead providing the future investment in the development of factories to be able to manufacture weapons within Ukraine. Now, while this sounds good, on the outset. Poland and France can say we're still providing aid, so they can headlines can come out. Aid is coming from us. We're going to support you as long as it takes. However, that aid becomes things that are not available today for the battlefield. That aid becomes things like commitments to provide weapons, perhaps in the future, where there are contracts being signed to develop those weapons. But those weapons don't exist today, so they can't roll out in the next few months and help Ukraine fight Russia. It sounds good because it's investment in the country. However, this isn't going to be direct investment like the supply of actual weapons. This will be investment into production of facilities to generate weapons. Now, that will mean that there will be a return, that there will effectively be some form of sale of all of these future weapons to these nations. These will be done under agreements where they will invest in the development of a factory, and then what is produced will be sold, and that will be sold back to those countries. They'll want to start to get money back. The ability to continually provide weapons, aid, funding to Ukraine will reach its limit, and is starting to reach its limits already. We're seeing Poland elections might be this weekend, I think it is. Part of the announcement of them stopping the direct supply of weapons is because they want to be able to keep their own population and voters happy, that the drain on their taxes will stop, and that they're able to provide for themselves, that they're able to supply the actual weapons of war required to protect their own nations. If everything's been given to Ukraine, obviously those countries are in a position where they become weakened and at risk that if some other threat arises, they're no longer able to protect themselves. So with all of this, with these things starting to be announced, the outlook for Ukraine is poor. We do see things like Switzerland announcing an aid package. They've announced a 100 million franc aid package today to Ukraine. However, Switzerland has denied the direct transfer of weapons. It did recently approve the on sale of Swiss weapons by other nations to Ukraine. However, this $100 million Swiss franc aid package is going to be in the form of a demining program to take effect between 2024 and 2027 in areas of Ukraine. Now, just exactly how that will work in 2024 and 2027 is yet to be seen, given that we don't know what the borders of Ukraine will look like in 2024 and 2027, who will be in control of that area at that time. Areas of Ukraine that are currently mined will be on the front line, and to the east mined by the Russians, and there will be some mined inside the front line to the west. Other than that, most of Western Ukraine would be unmined, you would expect at this stage. So some of the aid and funding that's being promised may well be quite hollow in its effect. I think this Swiss demining offer may be an example of that. If we find that Russia end up pushing across to the Dnieper River, to Kyiv, and take Odessa, will the Swiss want to be providing 100 million francs to the Russians to help them demine areas of Ukraine? I don't know. But also this concept of developing manufacturing capability in Ukraine. Again, this is something which isn't going to provide an immediate assistance to Ukraine. These type of things take time. The physical reality of developing areas for infrastructure, for weapons manufacture, need to occur in industrial areas. You don't want to be building weapons near suburban areas. You need to be working in an area which has energy infrastructure available. The processing and development of weapons often requires heavy industry, the ability to lift things like tanks, the ability to produce metal and armor components for tanks. So this will limit the areas in which this can happen in Ukraine. As I said before, not knowing where the Russians may draw the line means that the whole east of the Ukraine will be ruled out. Any of these sort of factories will be built far to the west, getting close to the Polish border, to provide them some level of security that if they are built, they are out of reach of Russia. Although, this brings me to the main point here, any factory development in Ukraine, anywhere within Ukraine, that is ongoing during this conflict, and particularly any which the Russians believe are going to find a future use in the development of weapons to be used against them, will be immediately targeted by Russian long-range missile strikes, which will leave both Ukraine and the partner country investing in that out of pocket. So while the talk from France and Poland and others about moving away from providing arms and instead providing investment in Ukraine's manufacturing of arms, it's a long way before we'll start to see that actually come to fruition, I feel. You imagine if it's your money and you're thinking of doing this, of investing in Ukraine, and you've got $100 million you want to drop into a factory somewhere to manufacture 155mm shells or manufacture tanks or what have you. Or Swiss armoured vehicles like... Swedish armoured vehicles, like the Swedes are reportedly also getting into a deal like this so they can stop providing their own Striv 122s, the Leopard variants, because they're already being destroyed. Instead, they can help Ukraine manufacture them themselves under license, and they can be paid for them. But even that, if they're going to invest in setting up the factory, you'd be very hesitant of doing that in Ukraine at the moment. It's interesting, this is what Zelensky is reporting as the sort of success of his recent travels, because there hasn't been direct aid, military aid and equipment provided, so he's saying these future investment plans are successful. However, just this week, we've had reports from Ukrainian leadership that they have moved some of their existing manufacturing out of Ukraine so as to avoid exactly these sort of attacks that we're talking about. Further, if they do plan to do this, these areas in Ukraine need electricity. Now, that's becoming more and more of a problem for Ukraine as they move into winter. So as they move into winter, their energy demands grow. The demands upon their electricity generation systems increase as people start to turn on heaters, as people need to turn on heating during their homes. Reports that the Russians are looking at targeting the Ukrainian energy infrastructure have been increasing. They were targeted last winter. It looks like they'll be targeted again this winter. Perhaps this winter targeted in a more destructive fashion, so as to cripple the ability of the Ukrainian military to produce weapons and to repair weapons. There are some references coming out. This is from a colonel of the Austrian Armed Forces, Marcus Reisner. He's saying it's necessary to strengthen the Ukrainian air defense in order to minimize attacks on the most important infrastructure facilities. After all, if Ukraine's electricity supply is seriously damaged again, the basis of weapons production will also be broken. Now, this is an interesting comment from a colonel of the Austrian armed forces, where he is saying that if the energy infrastructure is targeted in Ukraine, then that will seriously damage the basis of weapons production in Ukraine. This tells us that logically, energy infrastructure in Ukraine is used by the military. However, when strikes upon the energy infrastructure are made, it's always claimed in the Western press that these are strikes upon the civilian infrastructure, civilian energy infrastructure. Now, there's really no difference in the energy infrastructure, power generation across a country. The power is generated at generation sites and it is delivered to consumption sites. Now, those consumption sites may be military or may be civilian, but the energy infrastructure itself to generate the electricity and then to transport it is a shared resource. So, yes, attacks on the energy infrastructure will impact civilian life, but it will also impact military life. And the major reason for it will be to stop things like weapon production and weapon repair. So those things adding to the woes of the Ukrainians at the moment. Also, there's no ceasefire on the cards. President Zelensky has Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, has also travelled to Kyiv and has been there with undergoing some fresh talks about admitting Ukraine to NATO. Zelensky says that talks there were covering getting air defence to protect energy infrastructure again, so the topic has arisen again there. Zelensky's mentioned that It's central to global food security that Ukraine can produce electricity, and so it can produce its food supply. Stoltenberg has said that there is a $2.4 billion euro contract out for shells and anti-tank guided missiles. So that's 2.4 billion euros that NATO is looking at spending on shells and anti-tank guided missiles. But again, these are under contract. They don't exist yet. Now, when they do turn up over the coming years, who knows what shape Ukraine will be in, if these weapons will go to Ukraine, or if they may actually end up just restocking the supplies of the NATO nations themselves, who have already given so much of their existing stockpile to Ukraine. Stoltenberg went on to say, the stronger Ukraine becomes, the closer we come to ending Russia's aggression. He said, Russia could lay down arms and end its war today. Ukraine doesn't have that option. Ukraine's surrender would not mean peace. It would mean brutal Russian occupation. Peace at any price would be no peace at all. So these comments from Stoltenberg are very interesting. He mentions that Russia could end the war today, and he mentions Ukraine's surrender. So I wonder here if this is further signalling from the West that negotiations of some sort must start to take place, where he's hinting here that Russia could end the war today, and then going on to, in the next sentence, talk about Ukraine's surrender. These I think are hints of the position that we're at the moment, that the only real entity that can end this conflict now is Russia, and that Ukraine is being forced closer towards a position of surrender. Zelensky's peace plan has been rejected. There's no ceasefire coming here. Lavrov has stated that if the West says the conflict in Ukraine should be resolved on the battlefield, then it will be done on the battlefield. So Lavrov, it seems, has had enough. They've lost their patience with the West. They don't believe that there's any real attempt at this stage, openly, publicly, to negotiate. And this is because negotiations at this stage are being headed by Ukraine and by President Zelensky, and his peace plan, which effectively amounts to Ukraine calling a ceasefire, expecting that Russia will join that ceasefire, Ukraine then saying, okay, come to the table and negotiate with us, and Ukraine's starting position being that all Ukrainian land will be returned to Ukraine, but all Russian troops will leave Ukraine, and Ukraine will then join NATO. This has been mentioned many times by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov as being just entirely unacceptable to the Russians. The Russians have clearly stated many times their goals for this special military operation is the denazification of Ukraine, the demilitarization of Ukraine, the establishment of Ukraine as being neutral, and Ukraine not entering NATO. So those are the things that Russia will require before they would agree to a ceasefire or termination of the conflict. So that is not going to happen at any time soon. So we see Zelensky saying, yes, I'm talking about peace, I'm ready to negotiate, but it's on these terms. The Russians saying, you're not really ready to negotiate, those terms are ridiculous, you know it. You know what our terms are. Who we really need to negotiate here is the United States. The United States doesn't want to come out and negotiate because they want to retain the illusion that this is Ukraine fighting Russia and not a proxy war of the US. But ultimately, the US will be forced into negotiating with the Russians. So we have those two opposing positions, and then we have Ukraine suffering heavy losses. I'll get to the battlefield update in a little bit. We have Russia growing the size of its army. We have reports coming out just over the last day or so that Russia is beginning to form assault brigades. Colonel Valery Yuyev, chairman of the Union of Russian Paratroopers, has told Izvestia news agency, the military operation showed we need to have specialized units for storming fortified areas. The new units will include assault troops designed to break through Ukrainian layered defences, as well as reconnaissance units capable of conducting reconnaissance at tactical depth. Separate assault units and formations are necessary. Their specificity is that they must be equipped with a variety of fire weapons, mortars, machine guns, large caliber artillery. The brigades will receive their own tanks, light armoured vehicles, artillery, as well as a wide range of drones. So Russia looking to build now specialised assault brigades that will enable them to specifically attack reinforced Ukrainian positions. This comes on the heels of an announcement that Russian President Vladimir Putin has met with the former commander of Wagner forces, Andrei Troshev, and he has asked him to form voluntary military units for Moscow's special military operation in the Ukraine. So the Kremlin has announced this just yesterday. In the meeting, it is reported that the president said to Andrei Troshev, "You yourself have been fighting in such a unit for more than a year. You know what it is, how it is done, and know about the issues that need to be resolved in advance so that the combat work goes in the best and most successful way." So Troshev is a retired colonel, a former chief of the staff of the Wagner group. He notably did not support Yevgeny Prigozhin's short-lived insurrection. And according to presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, Troshev now works with the Defense Ministry. So we have the announcement that Russia is producing assault brigades. Now we hear that a former Wagner commander, which Russian President Putin himself calls out and says has specific experience, is being asked to put together voluntary military units. We get the impression here that Russia is gearing up for an offensive. They are forming specific assault groups, and they are likely going to lead them and train them with people from Wagner who have had the most extensive assault force experience in the Ukrainian conflict, with their months of involvement around the fight and ultimate capture of Bakhmut. So this means that while Ukraine is going on to a back foot, its offensive having failed, looking now to perhaps start to create its own defensive positions. Odessa, reportedly, the Ukrainians are looking to build defense in that area. Russia going on the offensive in the coming winter after the wet season. I imagine that we will see some form of a Russian offensive begin. There is talk that, or again in the northern areas, in the Kupiansk area, the Russians are starting to make advances there. But once the winter comes, we may find that across the line there is a push from Russia. There may be there may ultimately be the push down to Odessa as well. Um, Part of the reason that also backs this up are two unusual videos that have been released by the Ministry of Defense of Russia. Now, one of these videos talks about Kyiv, and one of these videos talks about Odessa. They're not a recruiting video as such. I think they are hinting at the fact that Odessa and Kyiv will be taken. In one of the videos, there are two Russian soldiers talking. They're in the Kherson region, I think, somewhere like that, and they're talking about the fact that, this is the area of my homeland. I'd like to live here. The other soldier says, the Russian government will give you land. Once we've conquered this land, they'll give you land here. And talking about getting into Odessa. There seems to be a signal and a hint to the soldiers that if you do volunteer and come and fight, and when we take Odessa, if you want some of it can be yours. The other video, similar vein, and talks about Kyiv. So with the knowledge that the Russian army is growing in size, with over 350,000, I believe is the number now reportedly, of people who have signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense this year in 2023. Since the start of this year, these numbers growing primarily through this stealth mobilization, where Russia's getting over 10,000 people volunteering every week to join. With that, all of these symbols, all of these indicators are pointing towards the fact that Russia is preparing for a full-scale offensive, perhaps to be targeted upon the north and southern flanks, so looking to take Kherson and then Odessa, and then pushing up to Kyiv. I think it's a reality that the Ukrainians need to consider. As I've said many times, a war of attrition like this one, a slow grinding war, is a numbers game. If you've got more artillery, if you've got more ammunition, if you've got more men, then it makes you more likely to succeed in a war of attrition. Now, Russia's got 140 million people. Ukraine's down to about 25. Ukraine doesn't have boots on the ground from NATO nations like Poland and Germany and the United States and the UK and Romania and Latvia. So they're down to 25 million. Russia's got 140 million. Russia is on a war footing, and its war industry is pumping. The labor statistics out of Russia indicate that Russia has a labor shortage. It has a labor shortage because everyone is employed now in the field of developing weapons and equipment for war and supporting the war. 140 million people versus 25 million people. Nations like Poland and France now saying we're not providing more weapons. The writing is on the wall here that Russia will, like Foreign Minister Lavrov has stated, they will decide this on the battlefield, that the time for negotiating, for sitting down and talking about how this conflict can be resolved has passed, and now Russia will resolve it. They'll put an end to this conflict. Where and how that conflict will end, we'll see in a few months' time, I would imagine. But I think that the news will change in the coming weeks from one of a Ukrainian offensive to one of a Russian offensive. And the Ukrainians will be attempting to defend that as their energy infrastructure is cut from beneath them. Yeah, I think that's a reality of what is coming. Now, moving on to, let's have a bit of a look at the battlefield update. Where are we? Here we go. So the update, a couple of notable things here. This is the summary update. So the Russian Ministry of Defense provide a summary update, not every week, but frequently they do, where they summarize the regions of the conflict and what's happened there over the last few days. And this one is over the period of the 24th to the 29th of September. And some of the interesting things here, the total reported number of Ukrainian soldiers killed and wounded for the week is about 3,500. Now, this is less than it has been over the last few weeks, where it has been getting up to 4,500, 5,000 in that range. So this is an indication that there has been some sort of a slowing. And I would suggest a slowing in the attacks by the Ukrainians as they are running out of forces and running out of equipment. We see in areas like Rabotne, where there are no longer reports of large losses of armoured equipment on a daily basis, and this seems to be due to the fact that the Ukrainians are just not using them at the moment. Either they don't have them to use, or they are conserving them, and instead fighting appears to be being done by small groups of men on foot. And we get ample footage of that available through the Telegram channels today. I was watching earlier this morning numerous videos of exactly that, just small squads of Ukrainian soldiers attacking on foot and coming under mortar and artillery fire and drone attack. So while the numbers are still high, I mean, the losses for a week of 3,500 men is dreadful for Ukraine. It's less than it has been, and I think it shows a decline, a tailing off in the offensive. I'll go through some of these areas. We'll start up in the north, up in the Kupiansk area, up here. And I will, so some of the big news out of the area around Kupiansk. So this is Kupiansk here, and this is the Osol River, which runs down the screen from north to south. Now the Osol River provides a natural fighting barrier. At the current time, Ukrainian forces still hold this land to the east of the Osol River, and the Russians are a little further east, where that red line is on the screen. But over the last few days, reports of 4 of the bridges across the Osol having been destroyed have emerged. Just give me a moment here. I have a couple of videos that I can show here, or actually this is an image that we can see here, which is of the Osol, showing where 1, 2, 3, 4 bridges have been destroyed in the last couple of days. There's also, just let me grab this link here. There's also this footage which shows one of the bridges reportedly being struck. That's one of the bridges across the Osol River. Now, going to the Ministry of Defense reporting. This is the Russian Ministry of Defense, so as I've said many times, take this with the amount of skepticism as you feel is warranted. Yes, it is Russian reporting, but it is consistent reporting that we receive each day and week. So it gives us the ability to be able to at least suggest trends. And as I've said before, often the items reported in this Ministry of Defense reporting are verifiable via video footage that you can find online. So in the Kupiansk direction, this is where the Zapad group of forces are operating. They've been using airstrikes and heavy artillery fire to hit locations of hardware and manpower of the Ukrainian 25th Airborne, the Ukrainian 14th, 43rd and 92nd Mechanized Brigades near Sinkovka, Peshenoye, and Novoyubovka. Now, Sinkovka is just up here, just on the outskirts of Kupiansk itself. It's only a few kilometers from Kupiansk center to Sinkovka is 7 kilometers. So Kupiansk itself is well within Russian artillery range. Now, a lot of the Russian artillery, the D20s and 30s and M-stars and that have ranges between about 15 and 28 kilometers. A lot of them do. So if Russians are fighting for these positions here, and so somewhere back behind here their artillery is located, Kupiansk itself is within range. Now, these bridges having been blown down through here, this means it's difficult now for the Ukrainians to continue to supply their positions to the east or the right of the Osol River, as we see it on the map here, and before or to the west of this red Russian front line. They're forced either to head back up towards Sinkovka to get across, or to make ad hoc routes across the river, or to drive further south. So reinforcement resupply becomes harder. Clearly, that's not a problem for the Russians. The Russians aren't using those bridges at the moment. The Russian desire is to get to the Osol River, so that then becomes a natural barrier for them. So given that we've seen these bridges be blown in quick succession, I expect that over the coming days we're going to start to see a push from the Russians along this front to push from Sinkovka to Kupiansk, to take Kupiansk, or begin to encircle Kupiansk, and then to push down the river here and push the Ukrainian forces south along the Osol. The Ministry of Defense then goes on to say, in this direction over the last week, the Ukrainians have lost over 210 servicemen, 5 armoured fighting vehicles, 30 motor vehicles, as well as 13 field artillery pieces. So again, in a week, not many armoured fighting vehicles or tanks mentioned as having been destroyed. A relatively large number of motor vehicles. Motor vehicles being anything from sort of pickup trucks to supply truck vehicles, that type of thing. And 13 field artillery pieces. In addition, 4 ammunition depots of the armed forces of Ukraine were destroyed near Ogotsovo, Berestovoye, and Kislovka. Now in the Krasny Liman area, so Krasny Liman is just south, coming down south from the Kupiansk area. So as we follow this red line down here, we have Liman is just here. This is Torsky, and this is the forested area around here where we hear lots of reporting of the fighting going on through here. In Krasny Liman direction, the Ukrainian armed forces, using their 12th Special Forces Brigade, the 63rd and 67th Mechanized Brigades, made unsuccessful attempts to regain lost positions near Torsky. This is Torsky, just around here. To regain lost positions near Torsky and the Serebryansky forestry area. As a result of the fighting led by the groups of the center group of forces, the center group of the Russian forces in this area, and their use of airstrikes, artillery fire, and heavy flamethrowers. These are, of course, the TOS-1 thermobaric multiple launch rocket systems, very devastating systems. We've talked about these a number of times. 12 enemy attacks were repelled in the Krasny Liman area. The losses to the Ukraine armed forces for the week amounted to more than 360 Ukrainian troops, 20 armoured fighting vehicles, 20 motor vehicles, as well as 12 guns. And 12 guns will be artillery pieces. Now, as we move down and start to follow this blue line here, we're moving down to the Donetsk region. So this blue line is a rough indication of the front line. This is Bakhmut here. Beneath Bakhmut, Klishchiivka and Andriivka beneath it. And then as we go further south, Holivka, and if we go a bit further, we get down here to Donetsk city itself. So the Donetsk region is really through this area of blue into the top of this yellow line here. In the Donetsk direction, during the week, the Ukrainians continued to attempt defensive actions close to Artyomovsk, which is the Russian name for Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Marinka. Marinka now has been just reduced to rubble. There's really nothing left there. Over that week's period, the Yug group of forces, which are the Russian forces in this area, have repelled 31 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces. So we can see there's been very heavy fighting through the Donetsk area. And a lot of this has been based around the Bakhmut area here. So 31 attacks over that week. As a result of the fighting, the Ukrainians have lost more than 1,760 troops killed and wounded, 40 tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles, as well as 70 motor vehicles. So in this area around Bakhmut and Klishchiivka, in the area here, some of the fighting is in more urban areas around Bakhmut. Perhaps for that reason is why we're still seeing use of armoured fighting vehicles and tanks in this area, where there is perhaps some ability to conceal themselves, under the structures or behind buildings, unlike when we get down to the areas of like South Zaporizhia and South Donetsk, fighting on the Vremka ledge near Urozhny and Robotino or Robotne. In those areas, they're fighting in open fields and small hamlets where once those buildings are destroyed, there's no cover there. The tanks are there and armoured vehicles are forced to hide in tree lines at some distance from the front line. Then as they approach, they become invisible. So Bakhmut, we're still seeing 40 reported heavy pieces of equipment lost in that week, including tanks. And that's perhaps because they are, as I say, able to provide or find some level of concealment in the destroyed ruins of the suburban areas and the buildings around this area. The Ministry of Defence reporting for the Donetsk area goes on to report that in counter-battery warfare, 13 field artillery pieces and 2 Grad multiple rocket launchers were neutralised. In addition, ground-attacked aircraft destroyed 2 ammunition depots near Zvanovka and Zaya in the Donetsk People's Republic. They're also reporting that in order to make up for the significant losses of manpower during the failed assaults on Kleshchevka and Andriivka, the Armed Forces of Ukraine Command was forced to redeploy units of the 33rd, 67th, and 110th Mechanized Brigades from other directions. So Bakhmut and Robotyno, those are the areas really where fighting is, the offensive is being forced by the Ukrainians. Now in South Donetsk, so if we just move South Donetsk here to the Varemka Ledge here. I must make an apology here. One of the followers of the channel, thank you, has called me out of my pronunciation of Urozhaina here, which I had been pronouncing incorrectly. So I'm attempting to work on my pronunciation of Ukrainian place names. Please, if I'm getting it wrong and you're a Ukrainian or Russian speaker, call it out. I will do some practice and try to improve upon them. So I hope I'm now getting that closer to the way it should be said as Urozhaina. In the South Donetsk region, Russian units repelled 4 attacks launched by the units of the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade in the vicinity of Priotne. So Priotne is this area here to the west of Urozhaina and to the west of the Varemka Ledge here. We've spoken about the reasons the Ukrainians are pushing into Priotne, in that they were trying to widen their sort of front and sort of flatten this out across here so that they didn't get too deep into a wedge and form too small of or pointy of a salient down here as they work down the Varemka Ledge. They do seem to have sort of stopped trying to drive down this Varemka Ledge at this stage and instead are pushing towards Priotne. During the week, the reported enemy losses totaled over 750 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded, 22 armoured fighting vehicles, 37 motor vehicles, and 15 field artillery pieces. Also, 2 AFU sabotage and reconnaissance groups were neutralised near Marfopol in the Zaporizhia region. So the numbers there, 750 troops reported. This is along this line, this yellow line, all the way along here where fighting is happening, not just in this area here. Okay, moving to Zaporizhia. In the Zaporizhia direction, the Russian troops continue to conduct active defense. Now, this is the other area of real main fighting around here. However, there has been a pause over the last few days by the Ukrainians. They do, in this area of Robotne and Verbove, seem to be struggling to utilize armored equipment anymore. As we spoke about yesterday, and as you can see from, sorry, not yesterday, but in the last episode, as you can see here, this green line indicates the front line. So this salient, or this pocket here of Robotne and the outskirts of Verbove here is only 15 kilometers across. it is not large. And as I mentioned before, Russian artillery has ranges of between 15 and 30 kilometers for most of what they're using around this area. So any Ukrainian forces that get into this salient here are coming under heavy artillery fire, and the ability to move armoured pieces of equipment down into here now seems to be very limited for the Ukrainians, and as such the fighting seems to be limited to small groups of men who are approaching on foot to the Russian positions. So this is dreadfully hard fighting, and while some slow progress may be being made, it is slow and it's coming at very heavy cost to the Ukrainians. So in the last week, the reported losses here are 330 Ukrainian troops, 32 armoured fighting vehicles, 38 motor vehicles, and 25 field artillery pieces. Reportedly, the Ukrainian Armed Forces Command is currently withdrawing the 47th Mechanized Brigade. The 47th was one of the NATO trained and supplied with Western equipment brigades. The 47th were being withdrawn from the area of Rabotino and to the rear due to the fact that the servicemen are refusing to carry out combat tasks because of the losses they have suffered. So as I say, the losses here have been very heavy. Now, while the 330 number itself isn't as high as what we've seen in the Donetsk area around Bakhmut, where it's over 1,700, or 750 in the South Donetsk region, these are, it seems, just small groups of men being picked off endlessly and being forced to attack without great support from heavy equipment. Now, the reporting does say here that 32 armoured fighting vehicles have been destroyed. There is footage showing that a lot of them are being destroyed along the approach, along these roads here, these supply roads into Robotne and into Verbove here. So not necessarily right at the front line of fighting. There has been ongoing talk of a build-up around Orikhiv here of Ukrainian forces and equipment. What the speculation is that the Ukrainians are looking to build up around Orikhiv, where they can accumulate and protect some massing of tanks and armoured personnel carriers and armoured fighting vehicles, and then look to make one big push down here, perhaps to take Verbova, or perhaps to split the gap and to try to then make some sort of a thunder run down to Tokmak down here, to be able to just break through, establish a breakthrough through the Surovikin line, which runs roughly along this section of this green line, this lower section here, and just cuts across in front of Verbove. While there have been some Ukrainian troops get across, they haven't established anything across that line. So we will see if perhaps just before the rains come in the next few weeks, if the Ukrainians might make a big push to get through here and to reach Tokmak. Reaching Tokmak without even taking Tokmak would be a large PR victory for the Ukrainians, and perhaps be enough to reignite some support for them from the US. Okay, moving down past Zaporizhia and down to Kherson. In the Kherson region, the Ministry of Defence reports the main efforts were focusing on preventing the enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups from landing on the islands on the left bank of the Dnieper. As part of this task, 3 sabotage and reconnaissance groups were disabled. Up to 250 Ukrainian servicemen, 16 armoured fighting vehicles and 42 motor vehicles were destroyed during the week in the Kherson region. 7 field artillery pieces were hit during the counter-battery warfare. Now, overall, in the fighting in the last week, Russian aerospace forces have destroyed 5 warplanes of the Ukrainian Air Force. One Ukrainian Su-25 ground attack aircraft was shot down near Toretskoy. 2 MiG-29 fighter jets of the Ukrainian Air Force have been destroyed at the Dolgintsevo airfield in the Dnipropetrovsk region. And in addition, on the night of the 29th of September, 2 more MiG-29 fighter jets delivered from Poland and upgraded to use Western missile systems were eliminated at the Kolbakino airfield of the Nikolaev region. Also, one Mi-8 helicopter was shot down by means of air defense near Kleshchevka. So that is the summary for this morning. I will see how I go this weekend with making some progress on the second of the Toys of War, or the Weapons of War series that I've done, where I'm working through a whole range of weapons being used in this conflict, starting from the ground and working our way up through landmines, up into artillery and tanks, and then up into jet air fighters eventually. But look, for those of you who it's about to be Saturday, I hope you have a good weekend. I hope you're enjoying the reports and the channel, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.